Hello my dear students, welcome to my English class on Madhu App. We have discussed two parts of the priceless gift. Today we will discuss the remaining part of the part 3 of the priceless gift. Okay students, before we discuss the remaining part of part 3, let's recap the last class. Mrs. Betty showed him the miraculous ring which her son had presented to Maggie. They told that if one concentrated on a distant portion while gazing into it, one would be able to see him. But they were said that they couldn't see Frankie through the ring. They requested Mr. Gupta to try and gaze into the ring and show them what Frankie was doing. But Mr. Gupta couldn't able to do, as the ring was not a miraculous thing. Next, several months later, Mr. Gupta paid a visit to Maggie and her mother, Mrs. Betty. By then, they had no news of Frankie. They were very worried and Mrs. Betty was ill in bed. Maggie requested him to look into the ring and tell her mother about the well-being of Frankie in India. To please them, he went up to her mother's bedside and told her that her son was alive and well. Then we will discuss the remaining part of part 3. Okay, let's have a model reading. The old woman raised her head a little off the pillow. Tears of happiness welled up in her eyes. Mrs. Betty soon recovered. It was almost time for me to return to India. I wished to go to say goodbye to Maggie and her mother. But the family was in mourning. Frankie had been killed in the fighting on the frontier. I calculated and found that Frankie had been dead some days when I told his mother he was alive and well. I felt ashamed to face Mrs. Betty. So I wrote a letter to them announcing my departure and bidding them goodbye. The morning of my last day in London dawned. I was to leave that night. As I was having my breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Maggie had come to say goodbye. She was wearing black. "Are you leaving today?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "Today is the day of my departure." "How long will it take to reach your country? In which part of the country do you live?" she wanted to know. Next, "I have entered the Punjab service. I shall not know exactly where I am posted until I arrive there. Is the frontier very far from there?" "No, not very. Frankie is buried near the frontier." The girl's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. "When I go to that part of the country, I shall visit your brother's grave and write to you." Then, students, we will discuss some meanings of some new words. Okay, students? Well up means come up. Here you see the picture. This is a picture of an old man and the tears were welled up from her eyes. Recover means return to normal state of health, mind or strength. Then mourning means lamenting. Then frontier means the dividing line between two countries or border. Bid means say goodbye or see off. Then some other words. Announce means declare. Then dawn. Dawn means to begin to grow light after night. Means when night ends, the sun comes up and the morning starts. This time is known as dawn. Departure means leaving or going away from a place or opposite of arrival. Bury means put or hide under ground. Then grave. Grave means a hole dug in the ground to receive a coffin or dead body. See students, this is the picture of grave. Okay students, let's discuss the text thoroughly. The old woman raised her head a little of the pillow. The old woman raised her head a little of the pillow means Mrs. Betty raised her head a little of the pillow because he felt well after listening the well-being of her son Frankie. Tears of happiness welled up in her eyes means he cried with happily means tears of happiness came up, appeared in Mrs. Betty's eyes. Mrs. Betty soon recovered means she soon felt well. She soon came to the normal state. It was almost time for me to return to India. I wish to go to say goodbye to Maggie and her mother. Means it was the time for the writer Mr. Gupta to return to India. But he wished to go to Maggie's house and he also wanted to say them goodbye. But the family was in mourning, means the family was lamenting, means they were very sad as they had not any news of her son Frankie for a long time. Frankie had been killed in the fighting on the frontier. Who had been killed? Frankie had been killed in the fighting on the frontier, means in the border. I calculated and found that Frankie had been dead some days when I told his mother he was alive and well. Means when the writer told about Frankie that he was alive and well to her mother some days before, Frankie had already dead. I told his mother he was alive and well. I felt ashamed to face Mrs. Betty. So Mr. Gupta felt shame to face Mrs. Betty as he told the lie to her. So I wrote a letter to them announcing my departure and bidding them goodbye. As he told a lie to Mrs. Betty, so he wrote a letter to them announcing his departure and bidding them goodbye. Okay, who wrote a letter? The writer, Mr. Gupta, wrote a letter to whom? To Mrs. Betty. Then, the morning of my last day in London dawned. The morning of Mr. Gupta's last day in London came. I was to leave that night. Means the writer was to leave that night. That night, she had to leave that place, London. As I was having my breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Means when the writer Mr. Gupta having his breakfast, there was a knock at the door. Who knocked? Maggie. Actually, Maggie knocked. Maggie had come. Maggie had come to say goodbye. Who had come? Maggie had come to say goodbye. Why did Maggie come to Mr. Gupta? To say goodbye. She was wearing black. What was she wearing? She was wearing black. Are you leaving today? She asked. She asked to the writer whether he was living today? Yes, I replied. Who replied? Mr. Gupta replied that he left London today. Today is the day of my departure. Writer told that day is the day of his departure. Departure means he will left that place. How long will it take to reach your country? In which part of the country do you live? She wanted to know. Who wanted to know? Maggie wanted to know that. How long will it take to reach your country means Maggie asked the writer Mr. Gupta how long it would take to reach his country, or in which part of the country do you live? Maggie again asked Mr. Gupta that in which part of the country he lived. Okay, student, then I have entered the Punjab service. Who have entered? The writer Mr. Gupta have entered the Punjab service. I shall not know exactly where I am posted until I arrive there. He told that he didn't know exactly where he was posted until he arrived there. Is the frontier very far from there? Who asked? Maggie asked whether the frontier was very far from there. No, not very. Who told? Mr. Gupta told that the frontier was not very far from there. Frankie is buried near the frontier. The girl's eyes filled with tears as she spoke. Who said that Frankie is buried near the frontier? Maggie said that Frankie is buried near the frontier. When she was saying Frankie is buried near the frontier, her eyes were filled with tears. She was very sad. When I go to that part of the country, I shall visit your brother's grave and write to you. So writer assured her that when he went to that part of the country, he would visit her brother's grave and write to her. Okay, students, now let's see the outlines of the paragraphs what we discussed. Mrs. Betty was soon recovered after listening wailing of her son. Several days passed. Mr. Gupta was about to return to India then. He wanted to go to them and bid them goodbye. But the family was in mourning then, as Frankie had been killed in the fighting. He felt ashamed to see Mrs. Betty and wrote to them bidding them goodbye. It was his last day in London, means that day was the last day of the writer Mr. Gupta. Maggie came to him to say goodbye. She had come to know whether he belonged to Punjab, and the frontier where Frankie was buried was not far from his place. So he assured her that he would visit her brother's grave and write to her. These are the outlines of today's topic. Now students, discuss some question and answers. Who raised her head a little of the pillow? Okay student? Yes? The answer is Mrs. Betty. Okay students? Good. Then second, what did well up in the old woman's eyes? Yes students? The answer is tears of happiness. Then third question, what did the writer wish to say Maggie and her mother at the time of departure? Yes? Very good. The answer is goodbye. Next question. Where had Frankie been killed? Yes? Very good answer. On the frontier. Okay, let's discuss some more question and answers. How did Mr. Gupta feel to face Maggie before his departure from England? Yes, students. Very good answer. Ashamed. He felt ashamed. Then question number 6. Where is Frankie buried? Here is the question. Frankie buried. Yes, students, near the frontier. Near the frontier. Okay, last question. What was Maggie wearing when she came to say goodbye to Mr. Gupta? Okay, think. Yes, students, the answer is black. Okay, there is a question is arising. Why did Maggie wear black when she came to say goodbye to Mr. Gupta? Think and answer. Yes, students, because in Christian society, when there is mourning or lamenting in their family, they wear black. Okay, this is the class for today. Thank you. Goodbye.